I really appreciate you guys being here and coming. I'm actually very excited about this talk because I just started kind of delving into research related to resiliency. So most of my work has focused on, say, when things go wrong. So with anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. But have a neuroimaging, brain imaging background. So I'm very, very interested in understanding how therapy works in terms of in the brain, as far as changing the brain, what we can understand about the brain in order to enhance treatments for anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so resiliency is kind of in some ways the flip, but a little bit different, but in terms of how we respond to stressors and challenges in a very positive way. And I think it actually, as we'll go through this, you'll see it kind of gets at the prevention part as far as trying to build up resiliency so that we actually don't see those problems to begin with. And so when we start thinking about interventions and trying to be the most effective interventions, really if we can get at the prevention side, that's where we could really get the most bang for our buck, if we could really figure that one out. So that's what's kind of led me to this. And so this is one of the first talks I've given really related to resiliency. So I'm excited to see how it goes. So I'll jump on in and actually just give you a little bit more of an idea of who I am. So I'm actually originally from Oklahoma. I got my bachelor's at Oklahoma State, then went and got my PhD at University of Kansas. Went out to San Diego for a few years for a postdoc, and then came back to actually Kansas City for my first faculty position. And lo and behold, a couple years after that, I got a call from my postdoc mentor in San Diego that said he was moving to Tulsa, Oklahoma. So Martin Paulus is now the director of Laureate Institute for Brain Research. He was my postdoc mentor, and so it was this very serendipitous, meant to be, I guess I need to move back closer to home. So I ended up back here in Tulsa at Laureate and started here about almost 2 years ago in September. And it's a wonderful institute to be at, especially doing brain imaging related to mental health treatment. There's no better place, honestly, in the world, I don't think, right now to be. And I get to be close to home, so it's kind of a dream come true. I don't think there's anything else about me, so I'll just kind of jump into the talk, I guess. So if you look up resilient, just Google it. This is what you'll see as far as the definition. So if you're talking about an object of some sort, being resilient means able to recoil or spring back into shape after being bent, stretched, or compressed. So bouncing back. If you're talking about an organism, a person, or an animal, it's able to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. So again, kind of that bouncing back idea, just in a similar vein. But of course, if you get into the psychology realm, we like to make our definitions a little bit more complicated. So this is one of the more simple ones, but relative resistance to environmental risk experiences. So challenges in our environment, and overcoming of that stress or adversity. And even more complicated, a complex interplay between an individual and his or her environment, in which the individual can influence a successful outcome by using both internal as well as external protective factors under high-risk conditions. So it's somewhat of a circular definition, but it actually encompasses quite a bit of what we'll be talking about today. So one is the complex interplay between an individual and his environment, in the environment, and how that works both in terms of psychology, but as well as also biology and how we kind of change in response to our environment. A successful outcome, what that really means, is it really just bouncing back, or is it something more? And then also internal and external protective factors. So to start out, I'm actually going to start with a little video. So and I think we can all kind of think in our own minds of people that we think of as resilient in our lives, right? But I think it kind of helps to put just something real to what we're talking about.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Beth Farnsworth.
And I'm CJ Ward. Our top story at 6 o'clock, a child kept in a cage by the woman who adopted her. Now, the case shocked the community when the woman was tried almost 10 years ago.
But now that girl is grown, a college student with a unique part-time job, and she is speaking publicly for the first time. News Channel 3's Tracy Lair has her story of survival. Tracy? Beth, Cynthia Vasquez is now a young adult making a life for herself, but she hasn't forgotten the life she left behind or the children she can help by sharing her story. Cynthia Vasquez doesn't just work at Casa Pacifica's Center for Abused and Neglected Kids.
She came in one of the worst cases that we've ever seen. It was horrendous what she and her sister went through.
Now 19, she still remembers what it was like when she first arrived at the shelter as an abused 9-year-old.
When I went in, there was two night staff, and they asked me if I was hungry, me and my sister, and we said yes, very much so.
After being rescued, Cynthia arrived in filthy clothing. Soon, she donned a princess costume, a change that reflected her life at that point. Back to something good after a living nightmare.
Cynthia's a little girl that came to us from a cage. She had lived in an animal cage in a basement for years.
Almost 5 years, in fact, from when she was just 5. When she first joined her foster family, all was good.
For the first year, it was great. I mean, it was like the dream house. The Christmas was awesome. I mean, we went to Disneyland like every month.
But then everything changed. Cynthia's foster mother received thousands of dollars to pay for her care, but
eventually it just went out of control. I was put inside a cage, a homemade cage.
Made of plywood just 5 feet by 4 feet, built in a basement with a wire mesh window.
On the inside there was a bed, and there was like a latch, so you couldn't like get out.
She remembers being kept on the edge of starvation.
I was only allowed to eat raw eggs with vegetable oil, and it was disgusting.
She remembers hot sauce put in her eyes and other forms of torture.
She put my hand on the stove and left it, like, you know, was like pushing it down.
Social workers visited but never caught on. And Cynthia wasn't alone. Her sister and other foster children suffered a similar fate.
In one of our cages, she would put cat litter in there and then like the cat boxes and food and say, oh, the cat lives in there. And then she would dress me up really well, and she would tell me, like, if you don't act happy and natural, she's like, you're going to be very upset when they leave.
Cynthia didn't know normal.
I thought maybe all kids go through this. Maybe it's just like a phase or something. So I was expecting it to like stop at some point.
It only stopped when a cleaning lady, threatened with deportation, turned in the foster mother. At her Santa Barbara trial, that foster mother's testimony was shocking. Sylvia Giovanna Vasquez blamed parenting books about treating children with attachment disorders.
Did you read those?
Yes, I did.
Anything in there about locking children up?
No.
Anything in there about putting children in rooms with their buckets and their urine and their feces in them?
No.
Anything in there about putting children in small enclosures?
No.
Anything in there about burning children or pinching them?
That never happened.
Sylvia Vasquez eventually pleaded no contest to 4 felony counts of child endangerment. She got a 10-year sentence, but only served less than a year in jail and the rest on probation. Meantime, Cynthia has moved on.
I have a job, I have a car, I'm going to college. I graduated high school with having missed like 4 grades. Like, it was really hard too. And I mean, like, I worked really hard to get to where I am, and I'm happy.
Cynthia has since met other brothers and sisters in her family.
My dad was 23 when I was born. My mom was 15.
And now she's a part-time office assistant at the very place where she first started her new life away from the horror. So when she speaks to children coming in now, she knows, really knows, how bad it can be.
I tell them, like, you know, I kind of know what you're going through. I lived here too.
I hired her because I think she's a resilient miracle.
Last year, her former foster mother reached out to her on Facebook.
She just said, like, oh, my dear Cynthia, I hope you're doing okay. I miss and love you so much. Cynthia didn't respond.
What would you say to her now?
Nothing. I would just walk away. I've always had the saying, don't dwell on the past, because you can complain about it as much as you want, but that's not going to change what happened. So it's always better just to go forward.
And when she isn't working at Casa Pacifica in Camarillo, she is studying at Oxnard College to become an earth science teacher. In Santa Barbara, Tracy Lair, News Channel 3.
So I think it's one thing to think about our specific definitions of these things, but it's another thing to really think about the personal stories of people who are truly resilient. I think when we talk about people, or think about people in our lives that we think of as being incredibly resilient, we know what that means in our even though we sometimes can't necessarily put words to it or think about exactly the characteristics that define it, but we can think of people that represent this, that are resilient. And so then I think it's up to science to truly try to understand what is that and try to in some ways bottle it, to try to understand what helps people to do this, what helps people to be so resilient to these incredible stressors. And this is obviously a very extreme example of horrific stress, horrific trauma that someone can overcome over time and kind of rise above. But obviously we all have stressors and challenges in our life, and kind of understanding how we respond to that in the optimal way, I think, is really what resiliency research is all about. So now I'll get into the kind of more scientific models or the theories of kind of the different pieces of the puzzle of resiliency. And this is a model that's proposed by Richardson in 2002. And he proposed that we all kind of have or get to a point, hopefully at some point in our lives, where we have this kind of biopsychosocial homeostasis. So this means, both at the biological level, the spiritual level, the psychological level, that we kind of get this balance, this kind of comfort zone where we feel like we're doing pretty good. We kind of we're happy with where we're at, and so we try to maintain that homeostasis. But then we have stressors or adversity that happens in our lives. And when those things happen, we have a lot of protective factors, or hopefully we have a lot of protective factors that try to keep us in that homeostatic balance, given those. And so a lot of times we're using different coping mechanisms to try to keep in that comfort zone, keep ourselves going in that balance, despite these stressors and adversity. And a lot of times that works, right? And a lot of times those coping mechanisms we have work in the moment. But other times, they can be significant enough stressors that we get out of that homeostasis. It disrupts that. So either biologically, say, our blood pressure starts going up, we're feeling dysregulated biologically, our immune system is messed up, but also just psychologically or spiritually, we just are not kind of in our comfort zone. We're not, sure where we are, what we're doing, our purpose in life. It kind of disrupts what we think of as who we are. So when that happens, we're actually get out of our homeostasis. The idea is that we then have to do some sort of reintegration to take that challenge, to take that stressor, and somehow reintegrate that into our lives as far as how are we going to cope with this and how are we going to respond to this. And they talk about 4 different kind of levels of responding to this and reintegrating. One is the more dysfunctional reintegration. This is, say, the turning to maladaptive coping mechanisms. So turning to substance use, avoiding or withdrawing from everything because we just don't want to deal with it. And so this is where we might see the substance use disorders come up, the post-traumatic stress disorder, because we're just not able to kind of really build on those coping mechanisms and get back to our homeostatic balance. We have reintegration with loss, where we do a pretty good job of reintegrating. We maybe build a few coping mechanisms or get back, but we don't quite get back to where we were before. So it's not necessarily that we're relying on maladaptive coping mechanisms, but we're just still not quite back to our baseline. We can have reintegration back to homeostasis, where we actually get back to where we were, get back to our comfort zone. And they kind of talk about this as kind of just getting through it, getting back to where we were, just kind of making it work, right? The resilience is thought of as a 4th level that's actually a way of growing with these stressors and with these challenges. And actually with this, developing additional coping mechanisms, additional protective factors from that experience that actually make us stronger or change our perspective in some way that actually kind of helps us going forward. So for example, with the the woman in the video, of kind of that perspective of now she's trying to help other people, and that kind of growth mechanism. Okay, I got through this. I can get through high school even though I missed the 4 grades. So using that and actually growing from it, and is thought of as that resilient reintegration. Any questions? Does this make sense to people? Okay. So, so the idea, obviously, is with a significant stressor or a challenge. Yeah, go ahead.
In all of this, you're assuming that we're dealing with a highly functional brain.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you going to get into that?
Well, a little bit, yeah, and actually, yes, we will. So I think one of the problems. So with this model, yes, you're assuming you got to here to begin with, right? Yeah, absolutely. And so if you're down here and you're already kind of disrupted and you haven't really found that homeostasis, and then you have significant life events happen to you, this is going to make this even more difficult. And so being able to even get to a homeostasis after that. So I think it might not come up specifically, but we'll talk a lot about like kind of early life adversity, and even say when you're pregnant with a child, having stressors at that point in time can influence the child that might actually then influence their kind of ability and their protective factors at that point. And we know that if you have, say, early life stress, that might, say, have just gotten you disrupted or kept you from kind of getting that homeostasis to begin with, and then you have another significant life stressor later in life, then this is going to be even harder. So absolutely. And the other thing this doesn't take into account is you're not necessarily dealing with one stressor or adversity at a time, right? That'd be lovely if life happened like that and we just had one challenge at a time, then it waited a few years, then another one happened. But a lot of times we might have something knock us down, then we have another thing, and when it rains, it pours, and then we're dealing with a lot of different things at one time that can also kind of, I think, play into this. So the different layers that we'll be talking about today. So obviously when a stressor or challenge happens, kind of psychologically, right, we have those changes that happen. We experience symptoms. But then that relates to changes that are happening in the brain. The changes that we see in the brain relate to, obviously, the brain cells, the actual neurons that are making up the brain. The changes in those brain cells relate to actually changes in the expression of our genes. So we'll be kind of talking about these different layers as we go through today. And obviously, so when we're thinking resiliency, it's kind of the opposite of when, or not the opposite, but when you kind of grow from that and kind of change that stress or adversity into an opportunity for growth, then we're also going to be talking about, obviously, changes at all of these different levels. So first, we'll talk about the level that I feel like we all can personally relate to, and that we actually kind of experience and perceive when these things happen. This is psychological and as well as external or environmental factors. So what kind of research is done to actually tell us about resilience? Some of the first, really one of the first studies was this Kauai longitudinal study that really highlighted resiliency. And there's been several longitudinal studies of children where they've started following children really young and followed them for 40 plus years, so that they can really identify over time, if you have stress and adversity, how do people respond to that and what factors relate to positive outcomes or negative outcomes. This study they followed children prior to birth, so they got parents that were getting ready to have kids, and then followed those children until age 40, and I think they're actually still following them. And so they monitored both biological and psychosocial factors. They looked at stressful life events and then the development, and this was 698 children. And what they found is 30% of those children were exposed to significant early life stressors. So this included chronic poverty, perinatal complications, parental mental illness, or significant family discord. And so then they tried to look and see basically how those children responded. And I actually forget the exact percentage, but it's a pretty high percentage that actually ended up doing really pretty well. I mean, up close to about 70%. In general, people were doing, pretty well. You don't see that many people, at least longer term, doing poorly in the long term. So they wanted to understand how are these people doing this? How are they being resilient to the stress? And so they tried to look at what factors related to positive outcomes. And this is, in what I'm covering now, basically psychological factors that have related to resiliency to these stressors, both in this study as well as other longitudinal studies. So this is kind of just things that have kind of come together from all of these different research projects that have been done. So one of the psychological factors is just being very action-oriented. So in response to stressors, doing something, taking an approach of taking action, and not being passive in response to it. Having an engaging temperament, so a kiddo that is engaging and fun to be around is actually going to invite support from other people, so they'll end up getting more of that social support. Having past successes with challenge, so having, say, more minor challenges or minor stressors that they were able to successfully cope with would then be a positive indicator that they could then respond to this more significant stressor in a positive way. And along with that, then, is the perception that they view change as opportunity rather than just as a negative thing. Having a positive self-concept, so thinking positively about oneself. Having an internal locus of control, which kind of goes along with the action-orientedness, but believing that what you do makes a difference in the world around you, that you can actually influence outcomes. High IQ, and then also communication and problem-solving skills. So being able to communicate and also being able to problem-solve your way out of a situation. Faith, as well as a sense of humor, and optimism as well. Okay, so these are all kind of psychological constructs. If you measure them at one time point, they're going to be predictive of resiliency to stress at a later time point. And then external factors that they found were being from a smaller family, so four or less siblings. Maternal competence, so having a mother that was actually there and available, as well as having a close bond with a caregiver of any sort, even if it wasn't the mom. Supportive grandparents as well, mentors, elders, supportive siblings, peer friends, supportive teachers, and pro-social organizations like youth clubs or religious organizations. Obviously, all this has in common is social support, right? Having someone that you actually have a trusting relationship with that you can go to. And this seems to be incredibly important. And along those lines, I'm actually going to share just one quote from this paper that was with the study that I was talking about, where they said the majority of high-risk children who had become troubled teenagers actually recovered in the third or fourth decade of life and became responsible partners, parents, and citizens in their community. The individuals who availed themselves of informal resources or sources of support in the community and whose lives subsequently took a positive turn differed in significant ways from those who did not make use of such options. And the way they significantly differed was that they'd been exposed to more positive interactions with their primary caregivers in the first 2 years of their life. And so that is in the early rearing conditions. And so what they're proposing is that really early experience fostered a sense of trust in other people. So even if they had significant life adversity in the years since then, later in life they were more trusting to be able to say go to people or go to their resources in the community and seek those things out. And so with that, I have to provide a picture of my son and I. Get a warm and fuzzy feeling of, well, at least I had the social bond going there the first 2 years of life, so maybe I've given him something. Another psychological concept that comes up a lot when talking about resiliency is the idea of hardiness. And it has three components. The first is a commitment disposition. So this is the tendency to involve oneself in activities in life and have a genuine interest and curiosity in the world around you. As well as a controlled disposition. So again, this is believing that you can influence events in the world around you. So again, that kind of locus of control that I was talking about before. And then the challenge disposition. So the belief that change rather than stability is the normal mode of life and constitutes an opportunity for personal growth. So again, this relates specifically back to what we were just talking about that came out of those studies. There's also, of course, we have measures then to try to measure these things. So out of these studies, it kind of came up, well, can we measure resiliency in people to measure how much, protective factors do they have? How resilient could they be to stress? One of the primary scales that's used is the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale, or CD-RISC. And I'll just give you an idea of some of the example items. So some of the example items there that people would rate basically how true this is for them is I'm able to adapt when changes occur. I have at least one close and secure relationship, which helps me when I'm stressed. I try to see the humorous side of things when I'm faced with problems. Having to cope with stress can make me stronger. I'm able to handle unpleasant or painful feelings like sadness, fear, and anger. And I have a strong purpose in life. So you can kind of see these items start reflecting all of the things we just talked about that came from these studies. But it's kind of nice to see that when, even in cross-sectional research, if we look at this scale, it does relate negatively to, say, symptoms of anxiety and depression. So the more you rate, the higher you rate on these resiliency factors, the less likely you are to experience anxiety and depression, even when we're not just looking at kids. Right? And I'll kind of mention this scale again later, so it's kind of one of the reasons I bring it up now. Okay, so switching to biological factors, and I'm actually going to keep this rather simple for this talk. I'm going to just talk about two different concepts. And one of the reasons I'm keeping this rather simple is because resiliency research really is pretty new. A lot of the focus really has been on when things go wrong. What's going on in the brain when we develop anxiety or depression or PTSD or schizophrenia or whatever it may be. There hasn't been a whole lot of focus on when things go right, what is actually happening. So we don't really know the details that much of how resiliency relates to some of these biological factors. But we now there's enough work that's been done that we have a conceptual framework to understand how it might work and where we actually need to focus our research. So hopefully this will kind of help guide you guys in that way too. So first I'll talk about epigenetics. How many people have heard about epigenetics, know about epigenetics? Okay, so maybe half and half in the room. So if I don't do a very good job explaining it, please Google SciShow epigenetics. This is the guy named Hank that will talk about different concepts, and he does an incredible job of explaining them in a very humorous way, in a way that really drives it home. And I actually watched it to try to figure out how, the best way to really explain epigenetics. So definitely recommend looking at it. But kind of the traditional way of thinking about genetics is that we have DNA strands, right, where we have genetic code, and based on those genes, it gets translated into RNA, and then from that RNA, it actually codes for different proteins, right? And proteins are the basic building blocks of who we are, of the very cells that make up our body are composed of these proteins. They make up neurotransmitters, the hormones, the receptors on the cells, enzymes, antibodies. So they're really the basic building blocks, right? So the DNA is kind of coding for what proteins do we have in our body and which cells. And so, the idea with this is pretty deterministic. So the idea would be we're born with specific DNA. That is going to develop for each cell into specific proteins that we need, and that's pretty much final, and there's nothing, we can't change that DNA. And it's true, we can't necessarily change the DNA, but there's a couple different ways that we can change the expression of the DNA. And that is kind of how it gets, when we talk about expression, and we're talking about how does that DNA get translated into eventually a protein of some sort. One of the ways is through methylation. So methyl groups are compounds that bind to the gene and basically tell it whether to express itself or not. And so it's basically kind of like a light switch to switch on or off the gene. So if you switch off the gene, then it's no longer going to be making that protein. And a lot of times we have, from our mom and our dad, we have different forms of a gene. We might have one gene from our dad that's a certain way and a different gene from our mom that's just slightly different. And so if you turn one of those off, the other one's going to now dominate more, right? And so you might get different proteins and different kind of makeup of those proteins. And so obviously if you change the expression of that DNA, you're changing those basic building blocks of who you are. You're changing those proteins, you're changing the cells, you're changing the brain, you're changing our function. The other way is through histone modification. So histones are these kind of protein spools that the DNA winds itself around. And the basic idea is that the more tightly you wind it, the less that gene is going to be expressed. And so this is kind of like a knob where you can kind of turn up the expression or turn down the expression of the gene. And there's a few different ways as well that DNA, the expression of DNA can be modified, say at this level, kind of through influencing the RNA and the translation. But these are two big ways that we know can actually relate to the environment. When we see changes in the environment, we can get changes in methylation and histone modification. So then that's changing the very expression of our DNA. So you know the DNA isn't changing. These kind of tags on the DNA are changing. So the basic idea is, so when we, for example, experience significant early life stress, we can get changes in that methylation status. And some of the specific ones that have been found, like I said, there's really only been, even epigenetics in of itself is a relatively kind of new field, but the focus has been a lot on glucocorticoid receptors, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second, as well as corticotropin releasing factor that are both kind of part of the same system, the glucocorticoid system. And so, like I said, I don't think we know the whole story yet of exactly which genes and we know that are for sure involved in this process, but we do know that environmental changes and early life stress modify that methylation. Now, what's really kind of interesting and cool is that, so this little girl is abused as a child. She's going to have changes in her methylation due to that event, right? But when she grows up and she has a kiddo, not only does she pass on the DNA, but some of those methylation tags actually get passed on as well. So this little girl that did not experience that abuse actually also has some of those same methylation changes because the parent experienced those and had those methylation changes. And again, their offspring can still have that. So you get passed on, so you can get the expression of genes that change due to the environment, and that's not only encoded into that person, it can be actually passed on. And you can think about how this provides a really fast kind of way of adapting to our environment, right? So we get a very significant change in our society, right? So all of a sudden there's nuclear war, or, you know, something that significant happens in how we need to survive in our environment is very different. It takes a long time for the evolution of the actual DNA to change. But these methylation changes can happen rather quickly and we can pass them down. So if we're in a very stressful environment, we need our kiddos to kind of know that too in some ways. So it's a way of kind of passing that on quicker. And this sounds kind of doomsday when you think about stress, right? You think about adversity and poor responses to stress, that you can be kind of passing on these kind of negative things, this stress. But if you turn it around and you think about this little girl learns a lot of coping mechanisms, has a lot of resiliency to that stress, there might be changes in that gene expression that she can actually then pass on to the next generation. So understanding, like I said, exactly which genes that might be important for that actually relate to resiliency and help pass on that resiliency. We're not necessarily there yet, but this concept, I think, is strong enough. It completely makes sense how we could do that. So it's just understanding exactly where that's important and exactly how that works. And the other cool thing is, you know, even though it's passed on, this is something that changes with our environment, right? So even if the stress and adversity change the methylation status, and this little girl has those methylation changes, if she, you know, even if this first level, they didn't have those resilient coping mechanisms, she can change that methylation status. There can be environmental changes in her life that end up changing that methylation status and then gets passed on to the next generation. So we can always have things that can change that. So in some ways, we all have the power of changing our own gene expression.
Is there any research on a person changing the methylation? You're saying you make a decision. So let's say you incorporate certain habits into your life that are whatever you saw in your parents. I'm not going to do that. And can that be
Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't know if there's as much research, I'm trying to think of something that specifically addresses that, as much research on, say, humans doing that. But what I there's animal studies that try to look at, say, you change nutrition of the animal, you change their physical activity level, you teach them a certain mate, you have them get really good at some certain ability, like kind of figuring out a maze, that you can actually look at their offspring a couple generations later, and it can influence their gene expression. So in animal studies, you can control it a little bit more. It's hard to say whether, it's not necessarily the animal's decision to do that. The experimenter's making that decision. But I
wonder if they could actually see the methylation, if there's some way of seeing the reaction to see that the genes were methylated in the parents, but they're not methylated.
Oh, like that it got changed. Yeah. I mean, so because I think if you get even just the idea that, I don't think what you're talking about hasn't specifically been done, but the idea that a significant change in our environment changes our methylation status. So even thinking about this little girl to begin with, she came with a whole bunch of methylation baggage, kind of tags that came from her parents, right? And that significant change in her environment modified that methylation status, and we can measure that. So we know that happens. But so far, really, the focus has been mainly on that kind of negative side of things. We get that significant stressor. What do we see in terms of changes in that methylation status? Not as much on, okay, so we intervene and provide some sort of resiliency training, or we provide some sort of parenting treatment, and then does it change the methylation? Exactly. Martin, do you know if I don't think there's been any research with actually looking at that, which I think is one of the looking at this methylation, the methods for doing that, what the best methods are, have not necessarily been solidified. And one of the problems is the methylation status can be different for any cell in the body. So even though your DNA is the same for every cell, the methylation status and those histones are different. So if you measure the methylation peripherally, say in your blood, that might not represent actually methylation status in certain regions of the brain. So in animals, you can get at this easier, right? You can actually get into the brain and get, and get some cells and actually look at the methylation status, but we don't do that in humans, right? So we're still trying to figure out the best methods for trying to figure this out. Okay, so this is just, so you can think about the old way of looking at DNA is a book that's already written, DNA and epigenetics. We've got all these tags that are yes, but. Let's skip this chapter for now. We'll come back to it later, all sorts of tags. So the other kind of biological concept related to resiliency that I wanted to cover is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. So a lot of words, but really referring to just the various regions involved in this system, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal gland. So I'll kind of go through this. So even before you get to the HPA axis, you have other regions of the brain that influence it, such as the amygdala. Right? So the amygdala is incredibly important for detecting salient information in our environment, particularly threat. So if there's something threatening our environment, the amygdala is going to activate, and it signals or connects with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, when I taught in college, I just always referred to it as the granddaddy of the hormone system. It kind of controls the release of a lot of hormones. So it releases hormones that in turn stimulate the pituitary, specifically the corticotropin-releasing hormone. The pituitary releases hormones that in turn stimulate the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland releases cortisol. And the idea with cortisol, so cortisol, especially if it's prolonged cortisol release, chronic kind of increase in cortisol, we get a lot of toxic effects from that. And cortisol is a glucocorticoid. So when I was talking about the glucocorticoid system earlier, where we know a lot of that methylation research has kind of pointed us to, it's also, when we look at actually brain systems, the glucocorticoid system is incredibly important. So it all kind of at least comes together in that way. But cortisol can lead to increased blood pressure, glucose, it suppresses the immune system. And when thinking about brain function, it also can lead to actual cell death. So particularly the hippocampus, it has a lot of cells that are sensitive to the cortisol. And the hippocampus actually provides a feedback mechanism on kind of a usual basis. So if it's just kind of a short-term increase in cortisol, the hippocampus provides a kind of feedback to the hypothalamus to say, okay, we got enough cortisol, shut it off now, we can, let's stop this. But if you get prolonged chronic release of cortisol, it can actually be toxic to the cells in the hippocampus, and you can get atrophy of the hippocampus. And this is most likely one of the reasons that in, say, when we look in depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, we actually see smaller, subtly smaller, it's not a huge difference, but subtly smaller hippocampal volumes. So there's actually a slight atrophy, and this is most likely one of the reasons for that, because we're actually seeing cell death.
What kind of long-term effects can it have if it's shrinking?
If the hippocampus is shrinking? I don't necessarily know that it's for certain known, but we do know, say, with depression and PTSD, we do get some, subtle, again, cognitive functioning changes that can happen too, as far as maybe, slightly decreased memory function. So that might play a role in that. It might also play a role in kind of fear learning going forward, because the hippocampus is really important in learning and memory. So, but these are all kind of speculative. The good thing is that there is some suggestion that you can see recovery of that as well, with recovery from depression and PTSD. So it's not like this is a final written in stone thing either, that when you get that cell death. And that's probably due to kind of some reorganization, and we actually do develop new neurons to an extent as well. But I don't think there's the longitudinal studies, especially with neuroimaging, are pretty lacking. So as far as understanding, if you look at hippocampal volume now, thinking about long-term effects. But, well, this might be too speculative, but we do know, like, say, for example, PTSD is a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's later in life as well. And so one of the things I've actually been interested in the past, I don't know if I'll ever go there, but is, whether this is one of the links that kind of gets you, connects those dots as far as how increased chronic stress or PTSD at a certain point in life might actually lead to be more susceptible to, say, Alzheimer's disease later on. Okay, so cortisol can be toxic to this system, right? So then, but like I said, all the research really has been focused on what happens when this goes wrong, right? But the idea is this system isn't necessarily always going haywire, right? We have a lot of different mechanisms that can help hopefully make this system resilient. And trying to understand how these relate to resiliency, I think, is yet to come. But one of the layers of this would be, say, regulation at kind of the brain system level. So one of the ideas would be, say, the prefrontal cortex, among a lot of other functions, is involved in regulating amygdala activity and inhibiting that amygdala activity. And so if you inhibit that amygdala activity and you're not detecting that salience in the environment, as you're not as reactive to that environment, then you can interrupt kind of this cycle. And so at this level, this kind of prefrontal changes could represent some of those changes in, say, self-concept, those changes in beliefs and how you interact with your environment, and your locus of control and those things. You might also be able to get altered number of sensitivity of receptors. So we know that environmental changes can alter how, say, reactive cells are. So each cell, has receptors that respond to neurotransmitters, and you can actually change the sensitivity of those receptors as well as the number of receptors that you have. So, for example, and I think one study, but again, this was with stress, caused a change in the receptors, but you can imagine the opposite as well, but where you can get changes in the receptors within that pituitary. So even when the hypothalamus is signaling, the pituitary isn't as responsive to that. So that would be another way in which the cycle can get interrupted. There's also other neurotransmitters and other hormones that counteract the effects of cortisol. So a couple possibilities are DHEA and neuropeptide Y. So DHEA is kind of co-released with cortisol and seems to counteract a lot of the effects. and neuropeptide Y. So these have kind of, they seem to have positive effects on the immune system and counteract those toxic effects. But again, how these really relate truly to what we're talking about resiliency has yet to really be focused on. And also understanding the best way to actually modify these things to influence resiliency definitely is not known yet. So bringing this kind of all together, when we have changes in our environment, we have the epigenetic modifications that influence the expression of our genes. And that then, so basically if you're changing the expression of your genes, you're changing those very proteins that make up our cells that can make up, say, that HPA axis that we just talked about. And so then that in and of itself, so if you have these epigenetic changes, that can cause changes in this HPA axis, how reactive it is, how much cortisol is being released. And then at our level, the research we do is you would then see changes in activation when you're looking at imaging, which I don't share any imaging data from LIBOR today, but hopefully we will have some resiliency studies in the future to come back and share some of that with you. So any questions or thoughts or comments on any of that, on the epigenetics or the HPA axis or anything else?
Well, if you go back, there's two things that you had, right? Which are hopeful in counteracting. So the DHEA that is reminiscent of like fish oil.
Yeah, so this is actually a caveat that I should put out there because there are supplements for DHEA, but it's going to show some of my limited knowledge, but the research with supplementation with DHEA has not necessarily panned out. So there hasn't, and so that's what I'm talking, the way in which we actually modify this system. So it's not as simple as, okay, let's just put some more DHEA or neuropeptide Y somehow in the system and we can have a positive effect. That doesn't necessarily seem to work. There's definitely mixed findings with that. So, and why, and, because obviously we have all sorts of mechanisms in here that help keep us in some sort of balance, even if it's a not helpful balance, a maladaptive balance. If we put more DHE in the system, it might not do anything, and we might just keep having whatever negative cycle.
Why you didn't have exercise?
Oh, absolutely. No, that's absolutely, yes. Well, and I was trying to because here I was just trying to focus on the different systems in the brain. But absolutely, exercise and nutrition, which I don't really focus on as much, even later as I'm going to be talking about resiliency interventions a little bit. But exercise, absolutely. So exercise, in what we know it can actually increase neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So in terms of that hippocampal atrophy that we're talking about, the exercise definitely can play a role in that. And exactly how it does it, it is another question. But absolutely, exercise, yes, 100%. Okay, so one thing I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a study that I am doing that kind of got me most interested in resiliency, which is the stress and resiliency in college study. And we're interested in college in terms of thinking about college as one of these stressors that gets us out of that homeostatic balance. And it's kind of a pivotal time in life where we have to kind of do that reintegration, figure out coping strategies, and we can kind of see different levels of response to that. And one of the other things that motivated this is the fact that we've seen growing problems of mental health in students in our colleges across the nation. So a 2008 national survey of directors of counseling centers on colleges across the nation, 95% of them reported that there'd been a significant increase in psychological problems. And it's basically, it started to become a problem where they're kind of overwhelmed and the system, the counseling centers aren't equipped to respond to this. And the depression prevalence for undergraduates compared to the general population in other research, the general population is about 9%, and undergraduates about 30%. Insanely increased. And one of the reasons for this is an age where you usually do see kind of increased symptoms. I mean, this is when kind of depression, anxiety, a lot of things are going to start coming on board is at this age, regardless of college. But then you've also got this stressor of college as far as changing your social systems, moving out of the house, different expectations. We have someone nodding a whole lot up here. Are you in that transition period right now? Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really become kind of in some ways a national crisis of trying to understand, okay, what is going on here and what can we do to actually respond to this? And so here in Tulsa, we're collaborating with the University of Tulsa with the Stress and Resiliency in College study. And our basic aims are to understand factors related to resiliency and mental health for college students, to identify the trajectory of those over time, so over their time in college, how those things change, and then also to develop a resiliency training program to help optimize responses to stress. So far, we just started this year, and so we got a cohort of first-year students to complete some self-report measures for us. We did also get saliva samples, but we haven't analyzed or processed that data yet, so I don't have the biological side of this for you. And then the idea is we're now going to follow those students for the next 5 years to try to understand the trajectory. So just to give you an idea, this is really alarming. It was really surprising to me, and this is hot off the presses. I actually just looked at this data over the past 3 or 4 days. But this is levels of anxiety and depression based on a self-report questionnaire. And we use cutoffs to determine severe, moderate, and mild based on previous research. And what we found was that even if you just look at, say, the severe and moderate, we're at 38, 39% that are actually in the moderate to severe range. This is even higher than what we saw in previous research at 30%. And this might have to do, there's a few different reasons for this. I mean, I think one, the University of Tulsa is a rather kind of a very kind of intense school as far as expectations. The kids that go to the University of Tulsa are a little bit higher achievers to begin with, and so the perfectionistic drive and kind of the expectations they might have for themselves are higher. There could also be a self-selection into the study, even though we really tried to kind of sweep and try to recruit everyone. But there might have been something to do with that too. But if you look at the mild, then you're at the majority of students that are experiencing at least mild depression and anxiety. It's incredibly scary and even more motivating for me now that we really do need to continue this research and try to develop resiliency programming. One of the cool things that we did, the CD risk, the resiliency inventory that I was talking about before, and what we found was that, and this has been shown in previous research, so it's not necessarily surprising, but it's just nice to kind of see the confirmation. And I apologize, these aren't the best graphs, but the higher they reported their resiliency, those protective factors that we think about as being related to resiliency, the lower their depression and anxiety, right? So it's basically tells us these factors that we think of related to resiliency, that hopefully if we can boost those for people, that it might relate to decreased anxiety and depression. The other thing we were interested in is how does this relate to, say, retention in college, how people actually stay in college, how they do in college. We don't have their GPA information or their kind of outcome in academic realm yet. We're waiting on that from TU. But what we did have is where we asked them how much they considered leaving TU over the past semester, and they rated that. And that did not relate to other kind of demographics that we thought it might relate to. So it did not relate to where they came from, so whether they came from Tulsa or other places in Oklahoma or other states. It did not relate to that. It did not relate to their high school GPA. It didn't relate to the class size that they came from in high school, so whether they came from Jinx or Podunk, Oklahoma, that didn't seem to relate. And whether they were working or not did not relate, which we thought of work as being a significant stressor that might influence in kind of a financial difference as well. And unfortunately, how much they considered leaving TU did not relate to whether they'd sought out academic help or psychological help either. But what it did relate to, so whether they'd been considered leaving TU or not, related really strongly to the resiliency inventory. So those resiliency factors, the more they rated themselves high on those, the less likely they were to consider leaving TU. And as well as anxiety. So the higher their anxiety, the more likely they were to consider leaving TU, which makes sense, but it's just really interesting to see how robust this relationship is compared to some of the demographics and some of the other things that you would usually think to look at. And it wasn't just these. I mean, basically, it's some of the factors across the board that we've talked about. So previous life events, depression, social isolation, friendship, informational support, so how much they feel like they have support for information. Their meaning and purpose in life, self-efficacy, emotion regulation strategy use, and then that resiliency measure I was talking about. So what we're going to be doing this next year is recruiting first-year students, getting the same information that we got from these students, and then randomizing them to receive either resiliency training or college as usual, and then look over the next 5 years and kind of see how they do. So the big question is, what are we going to do here? Yeah, you tell me. No, we're trying to figure that out right now. We did focus groups with some of the students to get their input on what they felt like this should look like, to make it kind of most engaging and most meaningful for them. But obviously, we're also going to rely on previous research. So that's what I'll turn right now, except I'll just point out. So obviously, what we're trying to do here is this is a time, college is a time where we're getting a disruption in that homeostasis. And we're trying to kind of target this moment of, where they're really trying to reintegrate and figure out how to deal with this. And so the hope is that we can get people to that resilient reintegration where they can add to their protective factors and actually help them going forward.
I'm good to you, so I can personally attest to how stressful it is.
Perfect.
But, did you look at all at correlation between how often they thought about leaving TU and their majors?
No, because we have that. That's one of the pieces of information we're waiting on TU to get. Yeah.
College is like one of the top 3 in the world.
Yes, absolutely. But I can say the majority, I think, of our students actually ended up coming from arts and sciences, because we had more of a.
Well, I remember
yeah.
I remember getting an email and they were like, would you like to give a saliva sample? And I was like, I've got a physics test.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we did get sex. I know. Well, actually, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, for certain, I'd have to wait for the TU information. So they're supposed to be giving us both the major as well as any kind of status on their courses as far as if they withdrew from courses or not, their GPA, and anyway, some other information. But absolutely, I think that'll be really important. But it isn't just when you think about the rates of, say, anxiety, if we are getting primarily arts and sciences, that we might even be underestimating some of it, which is even scarier then, right? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there have been several studies looking at different resiliency training interventions. So I'm just going to go through a couple of these. There's various ones, and really each study that you look at does it slightly differently. So there's not like one resiliency intervention that this is the best one, and we know that. But one that is interesting is called Transforming Lives Through Resilience Education, and this is actually by researchers at University of Texas. And they had 4 sessions, and they really, this model of resiliency that I showed you, they're really kind of trying to hammer that and go after that. So they talk about 4 typical responses to stress: the giving up, putting up, bouncing up, and stepping up. So that kind of mimics the different kind of responses to stress that we talked about before. They discuss problem-focused versus emotion-focused coping, so kind of focused on that problem-solving and action-oriented responses. The second session talks about taking responsibility, but they spin this in a very positive way as far as this is empowerment, as far as thinking about that locus of control, of trying to discuss how what role do you have, what actually control do you have in the situation, rather than being a kind of a passive victim in any kind of stressful situation of recognizing your power in that situation. And along with that, kind of empowering interpretations of various things. And then creating meaningful connections. So this is drawing the link between connecting to the social support around you and using that and making the point of the importance of that. And so this is kind of their graph of kind of that same model where they're talking about the stepping up, bouncing up, putting up, and giving up. Another one that's out there is SMART-OP, Stress Management and Resiliency Training for Optimal Performance. It was actually developed for NASA to begin with. So my understanding of it is they were basically doing training programs for astronauts where they would lock them in these kind of fake space stations for long periods of time, weeks longer and longer. And so they were looking at the effects of this resiliency training on their responses to that stress, that stressful training situation. But they developed the program in a more general way, so it could be used for general populations as well, not just NASA. So it is a 6-session program. It's actually completely computer-based, so it's not in person. It's on a computer and going through the programming that way. It teaches what we refer to as cognitive and behavioral skills. So in their words, they teach users to monitor stress, regulate emotions, relax, think flexibly, be realistic, and take effective action to deal with stressors. So you still see that action-oriented behavior. There's emotion regulation strategies, relaxation strategies, and kind of being flexible as well as realistic about your goals. There's other ones out there. A lot of them use the cognitive and behavioral skills I just kind of referred to. There's also a lot that use what we refer to as mindfulness training, which is really kind of practicing being mindful in the moment, being present of yourself and the world around you. And it's kind of an interesting one because when you think back to the models of resiliency, it's trying to figure out exactly where that fits in some of those models. It doesn't really fit really nicely. I'm trying to think about exactly where does that fit other than maybe being just an extra protective mechanism. But it's perhaps one of the most powerful, seems like, training strategies that really seems to have a positive effect. And so I think understanding exactly where that might fit within some of those resiliency theories, I think will be quite interesting because it obviously has an effect. And then psychoeducation and skills regarding healthy habits like exercise, nutrition, sleep, those sorts of things. So this is just a meta-analysis of the different resiliency interventions that most of them focus on those cognitive behavioral or mindfulness strategies. And the basic idea here, the further left the bars are, the more effective the intervention. So just the idea here is that they're all, they're effective. And they're effective in reducing stress or anxiety right after the program is usually what they're looking at this. So they're looking at right before you start the program, right after you end the program, and you see decreases in anxiety and stress.
Wouldn't the military be a place to look like the Navy SEALs and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're definitely trying to do different programming to see what works the best. So they've done some of what's called a stress inoculation training, where they try to kind of mimic stressful environments, basically to try to practice that stress and that challenge, and so they can be more prepared when they go in the field. They've tried various things, and I think there's probably ongoing research that I'm not aware of right now too that are doing that. But absolutely, the military is one of the #1 places where a lot of this is being done, for sure. So what I was going to say too, so all of these basically look at right after the programming is done. There's hardly anything that looks at longer follow-ups as far as what happens a few months, a few years later. So one of the things I think will be really cool about this TU study is that we are trying to look throughout college if we do this during the first year, how much difference does it really make in their lives going forward and their success in college, which I think is really important. We can get stressed down in the short term, but does that really mean that much if it really isn't building that resiliency, building those extra coping mechanisms and protective factors that continue on, which is really what resiliency is all about. So that's the hope with our research. So that's all the content for today. So just to summarize, the human brain, and thus every human being, is capable of incredible adaptation and resilience to stress and challenges. Our environment and relationships with others, particularly early in life, have a significant influence on our resilience. Internal characteristics that relate to resiliency include being action-oriented, having a positive self-concept, communication skills, problem-solving skills, faith, optimism, locus of control, and a sense of humor. Our responses to stress are influenced by and in turn influence epigenetic changes that alter genetic expression and thus impact the rest of our kind of biological functioning, including that HPA axis. And because of our brain's capability for adaptation, I think it's important to recognize we can promote resiliency through various environmental changes. So if we can influence our very proteins and our very gene expression by negative events, we can also influence our environment in order to have the opposite effect and actually influence resiliency. And so we need to be taking advantage of that opportunity. So with one last thing, so how many people know the kid president?
I think we all need a pep talk. The world needs you to stop being boring. Yeah, you. Boring is easy. Everybody can be boring, but you're gooder than that. Life is not a game, people. Life isn't a cereal either. Well, it is a cereal. And if life is a game, aren't we all on the same team? I mean, really, right? I'm on your team. Be on my team. This is life, people. You got air coming through your nose. You got heartbeat. That means it's time to do something. A poem. Two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the road less traveled. It hurt, man! Really bad. Rocks, thorns, and glass. My pants broke. Wah! Not cool, Robert Frost. But what if there really were two paths? I want to be in the one that leads to awesome. It's like that dude Journey said, don't stop believing, unless you dream stupid. Then you should get a better dream. I think that's how it goes. Get a better dream and keep going. Keep going, and keep going. Will Michael Jordan have quit? Well, he did quit. No, he retired. Yeah, he retired. But before that, in high school, what if he quit when he didn't make the team? He would have never made Space Jam. And I love Space Jam. What will be your Space Jam? What will you create will make the world awesome? Nothing if you keep sitting there. That's why I'm talking to you today. This is your time. This is my time. It's our time. We can make every day better for each other. If we're all on the same team, let's start acting like it. We got work to do. We can cry about it, or we can dance about it. We were made to be awesome. Let's get out there. I don't know everything. I'm just a kid. But I do know this. It's everybody's duty to give the world a reason to dance. So get to it. You've just been pep talked. Create something that will make the world awesome. Play ball.
But I was, trying to think of something motivational to end with. But what's really cool is then when I was looking it up, is actually this little boy's name is Robbie, and he actually has osteogenesis imperfecta, a disease that makes bones brittle. So he's had more than 70 broken bones and 13 surgeries. He has steel rods in both legs. But he's in this one CBS News story, he said he doesn't worry about breaking things. He said, I don't worry. That's my point. I'm trying not to worry about it. Like, I want everybody to know I'm not the kid who breaks a lot. I'm just a kid who wants to have fun. And so he's incredibly inspirational, but he's also, I think, an incredible story of resilience and obviously a sense of humor that is one of his protective factors anyway, is absolutely amazing. And I think it's a great story to end on. So, any questions?
One thing, a while ago I started studying self-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy by the name of Stuart Shanker in British Columbia who's done a lot of work on this with children. And I love the idea that you're doing this, with TU students.
Mm-hmm.
But you want it for your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I want it for my grandkids.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really happy you're doing that, but the future is
mm-hmm.
winding the clock back.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I absolutely agree, and I think there's say parenting intervention. I think there's more that can try to get out and say, how do you instill this in your child? Is there different strategies that you can pass on? It's interesting when we think about kind of the epigenetic cycle. No matter where you intervene, you can actually have an influence on the next step. So, say we have a significant impact on these college students who haven't had kids yet, but in the next 5-10 years they probably will, right? And then their kids hopefully might be better off because of the resiliency skills that we built in these college students, and then so on and so forth. And so that's why I say that the kind of whole idea of epigenetics is so empowering to think about any kind of positive effect we have at any point in life could actually filter down. But I absolutely agree, and I think, you know, I've as a mom myself, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this as far as how you build resiliency, and also thinking about my parents, you know, and to me, one of the most powerful things in my life, I think, is just seeing resiliency in other people. So seeing resiliency in my parents, and thinking about those factors of optimism, of self-locus of control, and thinking about how they embodied a lot of that. And just them being like that, I think, probably had more of a powerful impact than anything they told me or anything they did. And so I think incorporating these skills ourselves as parents or grandparents or caregivers can be incredibly powerful in terms of the young that are actually learning it. And obviously that bond is incredibly important. Developing that trusting relationship we know is important. And we can, you know, a lot of times we can identify when that's going wrong. A lot of times there's you know, either abuse happening or something, and there are actually interventions out there that can target that and that it can actually help that relationship. So we don't, you know, we need to get them out there more and get more people using them and actually see the effects down the road. Because I think sometimes when we think about psychological interventions, a lot of times people are warm and fuzzy, yeah, we're trying to make people feel good. We don't think about the fact that we can have these actually incredibly, like, just cyclic effects on a lot of people by just intervening with at one point in time, and how powerful these interventions can be in terms of not just this generation but the next generation. So I think some of this work in terms of trying to really show that and show how it does that could be beneficial and go a long way in, say, getting more funding for these kinds of intervention and these kind of programs that we just need more of.
Support, but at about 3rd grade,
it stops.
And I've been teaching in the junior high setting. Just finished my 4th year, and there's like such a need. At junior high, it's that 12 to 15 is
yeah.
Emotionally roller coaster for everyone.
Yeah.
Students,
yeah.
Teachers, everything.
I can still remember that age. It was a roller coaster.
So, why did you guys choose to go with college kids instead of adolescents?
Well, one, because they're a really captive audience as far as being able to get them, and they're adults, they can consent for themselves. But I don't think there's necessarily a reason why they would be a better target than, say, other populations. So I guess I don't have a better response than necessarily that this was a population we could definitely get to. We know when the stressor we're concerned with, when it happened. With adolescence, we could think about, you know, when puberty happened, which might be different for a lot of different people, or, you know, anyway. But we definitely, I think it would absolutely be just as important.
Because I think there's a lot of kids who don't make it to the college level because they've
absolutely
succumbed to the stressors before that.
Absolutely, and I think, like you said, because we're already looking at halfway resilient kids that they've made it to University of Tulsa, and so there's a lot of kids that would be missed in this that we wouldn't be looking at in terms of missing that, for sure. I absolutely agree, and I think, and you know, I've talked about all these interventions that we know can have beneficial effects and things, but we don't necessarily know the best way of kind of maximizing resiliency. And one of the things I just keep thinking of, because we see all sorts of things on Facebook and everything else that kind of bombard us with how to, you know, increase our children's self-concept and their self-esteem, and, you know, and all these things. And there's all sorts of fights on whether you should give ribbons and trophies to every kid or whether you shouldn't. And there's all sorts of posts on what's the best thing to do. And I don't necessarily think we for certain know exactly the best way, and it might be different for different kids, right, depending on what they've experienced in their past. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there too. But I absolutely 100% agree. I mean, we get them really, really young when they're, because there's kids that get early life stress immediately when they're born or even before they're born, have a lot of risk factors that they come with. Intervention then could be incredibly powerful. And then you have kids that get past that point, and then they're kind of struggling at that puberty. Absolutely. So there's all these different levels and depending on the development, what the best intervention is might be different.
I think when I think about the resilience piece, and I think about all of those factors that are impacting on our children and our families, poverty is a risk factor. It is something, and we just kind of want to blame it. We want to blame it on the people who are poor. That's a problem.
Absolutely.
And I also find it fascinating that babies in the womb are being wired for the world that they think they're going to be born into. That's not putting it exactly right.
No, I don't think it's putting it very...
The best way that I explain when I'm explaining it to my staff, okay, well, you're going to, this baby may come out really with a hair trigger because this is the world that it thinks it's coming
Absolutely.
into.
That's a perfect way of describing it.
That world is coming into the world in your classroom, and your classroom is very responsive and very nurturing and very consistent, and all of those things that we're trying to do to create that protective piece.
Yeah.
But I don't think we really understand this. Like, I know for sure policymakers in Oklahoma City don't get it. They just don't get it. They don't understand it on so many different levels. And then our families are struggling. Those parents children regulate partly from their parents. So we're worried about the regulation piece. Well, a lot of those kids are regulating from their parents. That's why their regulation skills they're struggling so much.
Yeah, and I think perhaps especially in the Midwest, we have this kind of idea of just get yourself up by your bootstraps, and that everyone should be able to do that regardless of their background. And hopefully my kind of discussion of resiliency training isn't synonymized with that, or because I think it's a different thing as far as because we kind of understanding that people are coming to a situation with different backgrounds and different coping strategies and different risk factors, and the idea that hopefully we can kind of change that with helping different things. But and as a psychologist, we think about these individual interventions, but at a societal level, obviously, there's a lot of things that could, yes, by changing education that someone gets, by changing their socioeconomic status, those things are going to change the support that they have around them, the ability they have to get that support that they need. And so it's going to have ramifications in terms of resiliency. Poverty itself is a significant life stressor that is going to have a significant change on your biological systems and how you're responding to your environment. And there's a lot of great stories of resiliency to poverty. But there's two ways of going about that. Yeah, you can try to teach resiliency, but you can also have more sociocultural changes that could hopefully change, that could help with that. It's a really good point. Anything else? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I see the non-intervention group, they're going to know they're not going to intervention unless you all create some kind of rules.
Well, we're not sure exactly how this is going to work yet. We're trying to see if there's orientation classes. We can say randomize the classes. So some of the classes, 3 or 4 of their sessions, we kind of take over, whereas the other group would do the regular orientation classes, and they just get recruited into a research study that we're monitoring and looking at mental health and resiliency in college, just like we did this past year. So the ones that are getting the regular orientation, we're just coming to ask them if they'll fill out questionnaires over the next 5 years. But absolutely, people talk. We're not going to be able to, no matter what ruse we do, I don't think we're going to be able to hide necessarily that. And one of the things we will look at, in some ways, I mean, we hope for a between-group change, but in some ways, if we get enough people into the study, if we could make this kind of cultural shift, where everybody's talking about resiliency and sharing these strategies, that'd be beautiful if we just see a cohort effect that once we start doing this with half the students, that we actually see positive change in the student body in general would be amazing, and would just speak more highly of it, even though it might be harder to convince ourselves that it's truly the intervention, not the placebo or something. But yeah, so we're not going to be able to control all of that. Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because hopefully they're going out and talking, we did this cool thing today.